Hello, and thank you for joining me on this presentation about the Texas Horned Lizard Detection Canine Project. My name is Paul Bunker, and I'm the principal of Chiron Canine, based in San Antonio, Texas. What I want to do now is give you an overview of the Texas Horned Lizard Detection Canine Project, which is part of San Antonio Zoo's Texas Horned Lizard Reintroduction Program. So a little bit of the background, you can see that in the slide there, Chris Bagley and her dog Gren, they were the first team to be trained as Texas Horned Lizard detection dogs. And it kind of came about through a number of coincidences. About 2.5 years ago, I started Chiron Canine, having worked in the commercial canine sector for 14 years, and prior to that I was 22 years in the British Army as a dog trainer, assessor and instructor. And when I started my own company, part of that was environmental search. So I do oil spills, oil spill response and leak response. And the other part was, or my intention was, conservation. And that's because my interest in conservation then could be part of my job, if you call it that. I say I'm paid for a hobby of dog training, and bringing the both together potentially would produce a capability and an asset which could serve both conservation and also the use of dogs. And the way that I like to run my business model, if you like, but the model for conservation is that I either take rescue dogs out of shelters or out of that are strays, and actually train them to become conservation dogs, or people that volunteer to assist in the conservation of certain species actually already have a dog which is suitable as a conservation dog, and then I train the handler and their dog so that they can become a conservation team and continue volunteering for any community-based projects. And Christine, Chris, as you in the photo, and Gren volunteered as part of the Horned Lizard Detection Canine Program. And in fact, Chris now also supports turtle nest detection down on Padre Island and the Gulf Coast, looking for the nests of turtles that have actually come ashore to support their conservation. So Chris and Gren are a multi-role team, but in this case, it's for the Texas Horned Lizard. And so basically I started my company, and I saw a funding opportunity for Texas for conservation. I Googled endangered species, and the Texas Horned Lizard came #1 in my Google search. And I actually Googled Conservation Society. So the Texas or the Horned Lizard Conservation Society came up, sent an email in, and it was Mason Lee that actually contacted me. And she told me to speak to Andy Glusenkamp, the director out of San Antonio Zoo and the head of the reintroduction program. And I did, and he was really keen. We had a meeting, and we discussed obviously the opportunity for funding and what the dogs could bring to the table. And as they say, the rest is history. Last year, we trained, initially it was Mason and her dog Ranger, but Mason took an amazing job up in Wyoming with the Fish and Wildlife Service, so she left us halfway through the training program. And then I knew Chris from Search and Rescue, and she volunteered to actually assist in this conservation program. She was already helping with the turtle program. And we tried Gren out, and Gren suited what we needed, so we trained them. So last year we conducted training on scat, and late last year we did a proof of concept in south of Texas on a ranch with Andy Glusenkamp and his team. And Gren actually located scat that a human wouldn't have located. Some of it was under thick vegetation, leaves, etc. And there's no way you would have found it. I mean, even when the dog responded, we had to dig around a little. Even though, you know, her nose was within an inch of the actual scat, we had to dig around a little because it was buried under vegetation before we actually found it. So that proof of concept demonstrated how the dog could bring a search capability to surveys and potentially speed up surveys, make them more accurate, find things that a human would miss, within those surveys, and therefore provide a lot more data and information in support of current surveys. So the next slide, I'm going to talk about the training of the dogs, and we imprint the dogs onto scat. And this video that's showing is actually one of my dogs, Poppy. She's an oil detection dog, so she goes out looking for oil in response to oil spills and also looking for oil leaks. And you can see there's a carousel there. The carousel has 12 arms. In 11 of the arms will be distractors. And in the case of our horned lizard detection dog, those distractors will be snake, scat, other types of scat, animals, sheds, snake sheds, things like that. And then one of the pots will contain the target. And initially we use the horned lizard scat. And the dog has to give a response to tell us which pot contains the scat. And with the carousel, we can spin the carousel between sessions. The handler's outside, doesn't know which pot contains the scat, comes in, the dog goes round, gives its sit response. The handler says, in this case, number 1, and it's confirmed, and then they get to play. And all the dogs are trained through positive reinforcement. I only use positive reinforcement, and that would be balls, kongs, tug toys, food, anything really the dog chooses as its reward is what we provide to the dog, so that to the dog it's a big game. The dog is just doing this because it wants to play and have fun, and we're giving it an opportunity to pair the smell, in this case of scat, with its reward. You'll also notice the dog gives what we term a passive response, that is a sit. In this case, Gren normally downs. And this is because we don't want the dog to interact with the target. We don't want the dog to dig up, eat or chew on or anything scat, because that's going to destroy it and make the whole survey irrelevant. But also the lizards themselves. Later in training, we actually train the dog to look for the lizards or the eggs, the hatching sites. And if the dog was to be active onto those locations, obviously it would destroy anything that we're looking for. So after the dogs have imprinted, then we actually teach them utilization. And in the next slide, you can see Chris working Gren. This is on a ranch south of Texas, Gloria Ranch, where we conducted a survey. And Gren is moving down the roadway under guidance of Chris, going left and right. And basically, Gren's just looking for the odor of scat carried in the air. If she was to locate any scat, and in this particular search, we didn't find any evidence of horned lizards. And I'll talk about why that's important in a moment. But in this case, the dog moves down the roadway or whatever area we're actually surveying under guidance of the handler. When Gren picks up the odor of scat, lizards and or eggs, she'll move forward to the source and then give that down response. And at that point, Chris moves forward. She can mark it with a flag, a pin flag, and then actually carry on the survey. And then data collectors behind the team would actually then take the data. Now, the uses of the canine are initially to survey areas to ensure that there is no lizards present. And that might seem a bit contradictory for a Texas horned lizard detection dog to actually not find lizards. And if there's already horned lizards in that environment, we don't know if they're already at a level where the natural resources are sustaining that colony. And if you go and introduce 40, 60, 80 new lizards into that area, who's to say that that won't affect the actual natural resources that exist, and therefore affect the lives of the current lizards that live in the area and or the new lizards, and therefore cause problems with them dying out. So we actually conduct a survey initially to see if there are lizards. If there's no reported lizards, then we can, or Andy and his team can determine that that area is usable for reintroduction and as part of the program. Then some weeks, months later, whatever Andy and his team decide, we can go and conduct another survey. In this case, we're looking for evidence that the introduced lizards into that area are thriving. So all we have to find is some fresh scat, and that's going to prove that if there's fresh lizard scat, then the lizards are thriving in that area, and that the reintroduction program is being successful. And then the third and final use at this stage is actually looking for lizards. And the idea here is that the breeding stock can be rotated periodically with fresh DNA. and also obviously fresh lizards. So the dog team can go out and actually locate the lizards themselves for capture for actually rotating through the breeding stock. So that's the three main uses of the dogs within a survey program: to survey an area to make sure that there is no evidence of lizards, to survey an area to ensure there is evidence of lizards, and then to survey an area and actually assist with the collection of lizards. And I spoke about data collection, and the next slide actually is a downloaded data from that actual survey that we did at Gloria Ranch, which is south of San Antonio. And what you see there is a Google Earth image of the ranch area, and the blue line is Gren and her track. The dog wears a GPS collar and the handler carries a GPS unit. This allows us to download the data from the dog of all the area that it actually surveyed. Now, in this case, it was no observed toads, so no observed lizards. So there's no waypoints marked on this track. But if we were to locate any scat, any lizards, any shed, or even a nest, we can actually waypoint the point of the alert and then data collect all the information that's needed. So not only the waypoint, but also we can take photographs, video, record in writing exactly what the waypoint number is. So for instance, if it was waypoint 001, we can say at such a time, at such a location, we located 3 pieces of scat, and then there's photographs and other evidence that's actually collected and collated at the end of the survey and submitted to the team so they can see exactly what was found where, and all that data then can be stored and analyzed at a later date or used for future research. So the next slide actually shows a schedule for a handler course. And as I said, part of the model that I always like to follow is that we don't go purchase dogs for this job. Always what I wanted to do was to give rescue dogs and stray dogs an opportunity to actually demonstrate that they can serve a purpose within the conservation community particularly. And as I said, I was in the British Army for 22 years. In my early days of training army dogs, we never purchased dogs for training as military dogs. They were all donations or from rescue centers. And we would go around the country, actually into rescue centers, and then select dogs, bring them back and actually train them, or people could donate them if, for instance, there was a family issue or something had happened that they could no longer keep that dog, or even in some cases they were court ordered that the dogs had to serve in the military because the owners had had issues with them biting the mailman or something like that. So all the dogs that I actually started training very early on in my career, and for a long part of it, were not purpose-bred as working dogs. They were actually strays or rescues or donated dogs that were people's pets. So I knew the value of these dogs, and what I wanted to do was bring that into this conservation market. So part of the idea then is that we take rescue dogs, and as I said, the other part is people that already have dogs that want to volunteer can join the program if their dogs show potential to actually do this job. And obviously not all dogs can be conservation dogs, and not all people could be conservation handlers. And to that end, I actually developed a short course. It's only 5 days. So the idea is the dog would be pre-trained, and then the handler, either the dog's owner at the time or a volunteer, would actually join the course and meet up with their trained rescue dog. And they would go through this module training to become an integrated team into the conservation surveys, because it's not just walking down a field with your dog. You have to understand the theory of odor, how to utilize your dog for productive areas, how to use the GPS collar, how to look after the welfare of your dog, and first aid, and demonstrate the systems of search, how to deploy the dog, how to ensure it doesn't overheat in hot weather. There's lots of things that the handler has to do as part of this team outside of even integrating into a human survey and being part of a team and not a hindrance, so that they understand it is a team effort in depth to actually conduct these surveys. And as part of that, the Horned Lizard Conservation Society last year part funded the development of a horned lizard detection canine handlers course guidebook, which is now produced. It's available, and the idea here is that this book would follow the schedule of the course, and it provides the handler, when they leave the course, an aid memoir that they can look back on, as well as a source of reference during the course, because the course ultimately would end in a assessment, a test, and a certification to ensure that they're capable of actually doing the job out on the ground. As I said, the last thing we need is a horned lizard detection dog that attacks lizards. So they go through an assessment to ensure they're capable, and part of that is this guidebook, which they'll take away with them, and then they can use that, as I said, as a term of reference, an aid memoir, but also as a study guide throughout the course. And then the next slide actually shows a scat collection kit. And I spoke about imprinting the dogs on scat, and a lot of the imprint process early on is done with scat, which is provided both by the Dallas Zoo and San Antonio Zoo from their captive horned lizard programs. And this is great because it provides a constant stream of scat for us to train the dogs on, and quite a large quantity that we can actually utilize in training. And when I talk about a large quantity, quarter of a small mason jar is large, because we only train the dogs on small amounts of scat at a time. The problem is, if we only ever train the dogs on captive horned lizard scat, the dogs will find captive horned lizard scat, because that has its own unique smell based on the environment that those lizards live in, the tanks and the sand, etc., and the food they eat, and they're fed ants. If we go into an area that has different environment, and the horned lizards, for instance, eat a lot of termites, that scat smells different, and sufficiently different that the dogs learn, well, that isn't captive horned lizard scat, so I'm not going to respond on it. So we have to train the dogs to generalize across all horned lizard scat. And what we do is we field collect as much as possible to augment the captive scat. And to help us with that, I developed this scat collection kit. And again, the Horned Lizard Conservation Society this year provided a grant. The grant has allowed me to develop 25 of these kits. And actually, if you look behind me at that box, that contains quite a lot. That's arrived yesterday. So that contains quite a lot of the parts of the kit. I'm still waiting some because of COVID has delayed delivery of some stuff, but the kits will be available soon. The idea was that they would be ready for the conference, which was supposed to have taken place last weekend, and I could have introduced these kits and people could have taken away with them, but as it stands, unfortunately, obviously that didn't happen. So we're still going to develop these kits and have them available so that people can actually collect scat from the field and then mail it back to me so that we can train the dogs on a large variety of horned lizard scat samples. And this allows the dog to generalize across the board of scat samples so that when they come across any horned lizard scat, they're going to respond, because they know it doesn't matter that it only smells of the zoo tank and ants. They know any form of scat is actually a source of target to enable them to get the reward. Remembering that also the dogs actually are taught to ignore other versions of scat from other reptiles, and we've demonstrated they can do that. So they ignore snake and other lizards, etc. They only go for horned lizard scat. So on my website, which the next slide actually shows the address to the website, at the top right-hand corner on the menu of the front page is a link to Horned Lizard Collection. And if you go on that page, there's actually a YouTube video which gives instructions on how to collect the scat. And it's important that the scat is collected effectively and efficiently to prevent contamination from other sources. And we don't want human sweat, or if you're a smoker, that's a very strong smell that can be absorbed by the scat. We don't want any of those smells on the scat, because they then become part of the scent picture that potentially the dog is looking for. So there are techniques to actually collect the scat, to contain the scat, and then mail it back to prevent contamination, so it's useful in training. So that video actually is me showing you how to collect the scat, how to store it, the data that I need collected and sent back to me. And there will be postcards within the scat kit that can be filled out, or on that page on my website, there is a downloadable PDF form that can actually be filled out. If you want to collect scat outside of me supplying a kit, you're perfectly welcome to obviously make your own kit and actually do this and mail them in yourselves. So www.chiron-canine.com is the website, and then top right hand corner on the front page, the menu, is the drop down link to the page all about scat collection. I want to thank you for listening in and having an interest in the horned lizard detection canine project. Hopefully this year we're going to get out to a lot more surveys. Obviously it's delayed because of the COVID restrictions that we've been under. So at this stage we have yet to go out on any surveys, but we're hoping with the reduction in those restrictions, we're going to get out soon and actually start some surveys, as well as start to get more scat coming in. And I want to thank the Horned Lizard Conservation Society for their support, both in partly developing the handler's guide, so that when we do start to enhance and escalate this program, we have that in place ready to train people, but also in funding the scat collection kits, so we can get them out there and get lots and lots of samples in from our samples library, so that we can train all these dogs. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you very much.